Welcome to the deep dive.
And today, we're really getting into Marvin Minsky's The Emotion Machine.
Yeah, it's quite a book. We've got summaries, Q&A, key quotes.
All sorts of material covering some really central chapters. We've got a good stack here.
Right, and the mission here, is to really unpack Minsky's, pretty radical perspective. What if feelings like love or fear aren't magical? What if they're actually complex computations happening in your brain?
Exactly. That's the provocative core, isn't it? How emotions might just be sophisticated ways of thinking, and maybe, just maybe, we could build machines that feel in a way, emulate feeling.
So we'll try to pull out the most important nuggets from all this, give you that shortcut to understanding Minsky's unique view.
Okay, let's dive in.
So Minsky really starts by forcing us to rethink emotions entirely. We tend to think of them as, simple things, separate from thought.
Right. But he argues they're not simple at all. They're complex processes, very intricate.
And you see the pushback immediately, don't you? Especially with something like love. The idea that humans that love could be understood like a machine. People resist that.
Oh, absolutely. Love is often seen as totally inexplicable, purely non-mechanistic. There's a lot of skepticism there.
The source mentions that resistance and how sometimes we just focus on infatuation, that overwhelming feeling where flaws don't even register.
And Minsky uses this term, suitcase words, for things like emotion or consciousness. It's a great metaphor, actually.
How so?
Well, you open the emotion suitcase, and it's not one thing. It's crammed with all sorts of stuff, basic instincts, complex adult feelings, everything in between.
Ah, I see. So we need to unpack the suitcase, look at the individual items, the mechanisms inside.
Exactly. Instead of just labeling the whole suitcase emotion and calling it a mystery.
And these processes, they're active, right?
Yeah.
The sources say emotions actually distort our perception, like love-making flaws vanish.
They do. They change our priorities. They fundamentally change how we think. Minsky's really focused on these dynamic processes, how they're shaped by our cognitive structures. It's less about just biology, like maybe Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions, and more about the complex computation underneath.
The internal gears turning, basically.
So if emotions are these complex processes, let's take that big example, love. Minsky says it's way more than just one feeling.
He digs into that difference between infatuation, that intense, almost blinding positivity, and, other kinds of love.
Yeah, broader love, loyalty, tenderness, attachment to family, society, not just a romantic partner. It's a much wider spectrum.
There's that great Richard Feynman quote in the sources, too, about falling in love with an idea.
Oh, right. How that initial excitement just swamps any sense of the difficulties involved. Minsky draws a parallel to falling for a person.
And that state, infatuation especially, he says it can cause cognitive impairment, like our critical thinking just takes a break.
Temporarily, yeah. The usual judgment gets sidelined, which makes you ask, what is lasting love then, beyond that first rush? And how do these intense states make us act in ways that seem, not entirely rational?
It definitely puts a different spin on those intense early feelings we tend to romanticize.
Okay, so to understand these emotional processes, Minsky uses another key metaphor for the mind itself. It's not a single control room.
Right, it's a cloud of resources.
Yeah.
Complex and distributed.
Exactly. He argues against that old idea of a central command. In his view, emotions emerge from how all these different mental resources interact and function together. It's dynamic.
And it's not fixed. The sources mention that our emotional state is constantly shifting, rearranging based on the situation, what's going on inside us.
And when those shifts are big, he calls them emotion cascades. One feeling can trigger a whole chain reaction.
That takes over everything, dominates your thoughts, changes how you see things.
Pretty much. It highlights how interconnected it all is. One strong emotion can hijack your focus, suppress other goals, and totally warp your decision-making.
Okay, this next part about attachments. This feels really central to his argument.
It really is. He suggests our strongest, most fundamental emotions often come from attachments, especially to caregivers, who he calls imprimers.
Because human babies take so long to develop, right?
Yeah.
They have to learn so much from these early figures, imitating, absorbing values.
Exactly. Imprimers, parents, sure, but also other significant people, maybe even public figures, they shape our values and how we react emotionally through praise, through reprimands. They essentially assign value, positive or negative, to a child's developing goals.
And we build internal mental models of them so we can judge ourselves even when they're not there.
That's the idea. It's a huge part of how our conscience, our moral sense develops. And it's where self-conscious emotions like guilt and pride really start to take root.
The source has that vivid example, Carol playing with mud. Her feeling about it changes based on how others react.
Right. The initial goal might just be sensory, but a parent's reaction, or even a stranger's, makes it feel good or bad. And then there's the pride face from a parent after a puzzle.
That creates the drive to seek more challenges. And shame after failing makes you rethink things, building those self-conscious feelings.
Precisely. And achieving goals creates pleasure, which isn't just nice. It actually helps cement the memory, the learning. It associates the action with success. Our long childhood lets us build these really complex moral frameworks, conscience, values, ideals that stick with us.
And basic attachment is vital for survival too, isn't it? For
Yeah.
infants, animals, the quality of that interaction really matters.
Hugely important. And having multiple imprimers can be enriching. But the sources note that if they send conflicting messages, well, that can complicate things for a child's self-image and learning consistent behaviors.
So things like self-discipline, being consistent, that comes from modeling ourselves on traits shaped by these imprimers.
Largely, yes. It fosters self-reliance, helps build a coherent sense of who we are. Our goals throughout life are still tied to these early emotional lessons, shaping our identity and how we fit into society.
Okay, shifting from external influences like imprimers to internal experiences like pain. Minsky sees this as another kind of mental cascade.
Definitely. Pain's obvious role is protection, right? Darwin noted how it drives animals to escape danger, shake off an injury. It's fundamental.
It grabs your attention, focuses it right on the body part, makes you want to avoid whatever caused it, teaches you not to do it again.
But, and this is key, when pain is intense or goes on, it can trigger that cascade effect. It disrupts everything else, plans, thoughts. It just monopolizes your mental resources.
The source quotes, "Suffering imprisons you," that feeling of helplessness.
Exactly. And Minsky makes a useful distinction here. Pain is the physical signal. Hurting is the subjective experience of feeling it. And suffering is the higher level emotional response when that hurting messes with your goals and plans. Suffering is about the impact of the pain on your life.
There's that really strange idea mentioned from Dennett, I think, that maybe you can lessen pain by intensely focusing on analyzing it.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. The idea is if you devote enough mental resources to just studying the sensation itself, objectively, maybe there's no room left to mind it. The subjective hurting might actually decrease.
Wow. That suggests a surprising level of cognitive control, potentially.
It does. Both pain and pleasure grab our attention, motivate us, just in opposite directions. The sources also briefly mention things like correctors, suppressors, censors, internal critics that help us avoid mistakes but need to be balanced so we don't stifle creativity.
It seems like getting some awareness of these cascades, these internal mechanisms, is really key to managing moods, reactions, maybe even pain itself.
Okay, now for maybe the biggest suitcase word of them all, consciousness.
Yes. The hard problem.
Yeah.
Still debated, right? What it is, who has it. Dennett calls it a mystery.
Minsky pushes back hard against the idea of a single source for consciousness. He argues it arises from the complex interaction of many different cognitive processes working together, unifying our experience, giving us that sense of identity.
So it's another emergent property, like emotions, packed with subskills. Perception, attention, self-awareness, memory. The Joan example in the source illustrates this, right? Reacting, deciding, reflecting, all blending together.
Exactly. And Hume pointed out ages ago how bad we are at actually looking inside and seeing how it works. We're mostly unaware of the intricate stuff happening subconsciously, like driving a car without knowing anything about the engine.
We tend to overrate how conscious we really are. Our feeling of being aware might not be the whole story.
Right. It might be based more on interpreted descriptions our mind creates rather than direct access. Certain high-level processes get activated, and that gives rise to the sense of consciousness, but the mechanics are hidden.
And self-models are key here, too. We build our sense of identity through interaction and reflection. But how good is that reflection?
Depends on the accuracy of our self-models, which Minsky suggests aren't fixed. We might switch between different models of ourselves depending on the situation. So our self-awareness isn't some perfect mirror. It's constructed and fallible.
This really goes against that intuitive idea of the Cartesian theater, a single stage in the mind where thoughts appear for one observer, the self.
Yeah, the sources favor something more like the global workspace theory consciousness, emerging from many competing processes, vying for access to shared information.
And our feeling that consciousness is this continuous stream focused on the present. Samuel Johnson said, recollection and anticipation fill up almost all our moments.
Exactly. Minsky argues our conscious narrative is often constructed after things happen, looking back or planning forward, not truly living in the instant. That challenges a very basic assumption most of us have.
It really is a puzzle. Iris Murdoch's quote sums it up. No one's really explained what that weird stuff human consciousness is really made of.
Minsky's take is pretty critical. It's multifaceted, not unified, and our subjective feeling of awareness isn't necessarily reliable. It's often a story told after the fact, based on interpretations, like his A-brain, B-brain metaphor suggests. The interpreting part, B-brain, doesn't have direct access to the raw sensory data, A-brain.
So Minsky tries to bring some order to this complexity with his proposed 6 levels of mental activity.
Right, he emphasizes our unique symbolic ability, using symbols to gain some control over things, as Pagels noted. Minsky adds we have this real flair for inventing new ways to think.
And these levels build up, from basic instincts to complex self-reflection.
Exactly. Level 1, instinctive reactions. Totally basic, inborn stuff. Turning your head to a noise.
Level 2, learned reactions. Modifying those instincts through experience. Learning a car speeding towards you is dangerous.
Level 3, deliberative thinking. Consciously weighing options, making choices, deciding what to say next.
Level 4, reflective thinking. Stepping back, thinking about past actions, outcomes, learning from mistakes.
Level 5, self-reflective thinking. Tracking personal goals, how actions fit with your identity, social standing. Much more inward-looking.
And level 6, which he sees as really human, self-conscious emotions. Evaluating yourself against ideals, expectations, feeling pride or embarrassment.
And that Jones scenario comes up again, showing how even a quick event involves all these levels working together: instincts, learning, deliberation, reflection, the whole stack.
Imagination and prediction are key across these levels too, using knowledge to simulate possibilities. If-then rules, simulating outcomes like a machine.
That relies on his simulus idea, mental images simulating reality based on abstract models, crucial for creativity and planning.
But it's that level 6 self-conscious reflection, judging ourselves against values, that really defines us, shaping behavior and identity.
So thinking itself, in Minsky's view, is this incredibly complex machinery involving these levels and also what he calls cognitive critics.
William James said thinking is always influenced by desires. Minsky adds that we adults have this illusion of simplicity about it.
Right, because all the complex structures we built as kids become second nature, like an amnesia of infancy. We forget the effort involved.
Yeah, you don't notice the machinery until it breaks down or hits a wall. That's where these cognitive critics might come in.
Think of them as internal checks and balances, little routines that spot problems, suggest approaches, guide decisions, but they can also cause trouble if they're too critical or contradictory.
It's an interesting way to think about mental illness, maybe. Like the critics malfunctioning, like a mental software virus.
It's one way to frame it. These critics influence what we even pay attention to. Based on our goals and the context, they're filters.
And emotional thinking fits in here too. The sources say a flash of impatience or anger can cut through a problem. Emotions aren't just passive, they act like critics or switches.
Exactly. They can interrupt, redirect focus, force simplification, even encourage us. They're part of the thinking machinery.
And there are different types of critics: basic reactions, learned ones, those higher-level reflective ones. A good toolkit of critics makes for better thinking.
And another concept is cognitive contexts, like mental workspaces that keep track of our current goals, what we know, what resources are active. That's how we switch tasks. What keeps track of the tasks that we have postponed? Contexts do.
He also connects this back to the body, right? Emotional embodiment.
Yes, the feedback loop. How we express emotions physically feeds back and influences the mental state itself. It's not just a one-way street.
This framework also helps explain human resourcefulness and learning, qualities often debated when comparing us to machines.
Yeah, you had Descartes saying, machines lack our universal reason. Darwin seeing it as a difference of degree with animals. And Turing showing machines could be resourceful with the right programming.
Minsky seems to bridge this. He emphasizes our versatility, having multiple ways to think, and, crucially, switching strategies when one fails. Like his quote, "If you understand something in only one way, then you scarcely understand it at all."
Absolutely. True understanding needs multiple perspectives. Key parts of this are taking different viewpoints, switching quickly, knowing what's relevant, and always expanding our toolkit.
Learning is obviously central, not just rules, but making new connections, generalizing better, applying knowledge from one area to another. He calls that credit assignment, right? Reflecting and associating effectively.
Yes. And he sees creativity or genius not as magic, but as common traits. Expertise, confidence, persistence, diverse strategies, reflection just developed to an unusually high degree. It builds on existing ideas. Like Pauling said, the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas.
This all depends on how we organize knowledge, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Knowledge representation scripts, networks, frames,
Those frames with default assumptions are key for making quick guesses in familiar situations.
and learning transfer, applying knowledge across contexts. That's a big sign of intelligence, understanding how you learn.
It's the brain's ability to organize, adapt strategies, reflect. That's what gives us our flexibility and resourcefulness.
Which brings us right back to the self. If the mind is this cloud, these processes, what is that feeling of being a single me?
Minsky's answer is challenging. It's not one thing. It's a collection of models. We build models of ourselves, models of others.
And we need multiple models because we act differently, relate differently in different situations.
Exactly. Understanding complex behavior, ours or someone else's, requires integrating different perspectives or models.
We tend to simplify personality into traits, but he says it's more complex, innate stuff, experience, culture, self-control.
Right. So why do we feel like a single self? It's a powerful intuition, even though we know we have internal conflicts. Remember that Hermann Hesse quote, Harry consists of 100 or 1,000 selves.
Minsky thinks the self is really just these interconnected models working together, not a central controller.
But the idea of a unified self is incredibly useful, isn't it? For responsibility, social interaction, making sense of our own lives. Like Dennett's idea of us being virtuoso novelists writing our autobiography.
Trying to make it all cohere into one story. The self is the narrative we construct.
Okay, let's loop back to pleasure and pain again, seeing them now as motivators within this whole system.
Aristotle's idea. Pleasure as fulfillment. Pain as a negative shift. Minsky sees pleasure often tied to achieving goals, right? Reinforcing learning.
Yes, it acts like a tag saying, that worked, do more of that. But pleasure itself is tricky. It's not one thing, satisfaction, relief, joy. Even criticism can eventually lead to a kind of pleasure through learning. It's hard to bend down.
And pleasure tends to suppress other things, doesn't it? Focuses us on what feels good.
It does. It biases our decisions. But Minsky also highlights curiosity, that exploration pleasure, the drive to tackle hard things, even frustrating things, for the sake of knowledge, finding joy in the struggle of learning.
So both pleasure and pain are steering mechanisms. Pleasure towards goals, pain away from harm.
And failure, discomfort. They're not just bad, they're feedback that prompt reevaluation, adaptation, maybe deeper learning, thinking, okay, I learned from that, or maybe my mistake can help someone else.
Wow. Okay, trying to pull all this together. Minsky weaves a complex picture.
He really does. You see the thread. Complex emotions arise from cognitive processes, shaped by attachments and imprimers, influenced by cascades like pain and suffering. Consciousness emerges from this activity, operating across different levels of thought, using intricate thinking machinery with critics, enabling resourcefulness and learning, all contributing to the construction of the self as multiple models unified by a narrative.
It completely challenges simple ideas about mind and emotion. Feelings aren't separate, they're part of thinking.
And understanding that our feelings come from these complex internal computations, that has huge implications for psychology, for how we think about mental well-being.
Recognizing those internal critics, how emotions interact with them, it sheds light on decision-making, self-control.
Minsky suggests that reflecting on these processes, our emotions, critics, self-models, isn't just navel-gazing. It's actually a way to become more self-aware, make better choices, maybe even become more intelligent.
It comes back to that easy is hard paradox. The things that feel simplest, feeling and emotion, being conscious, are built on staggering hidden complexity. And not seeing that complexity is a barrier to understanding ourselves. Minsky really does take apart how we think about, well, thinking and feeling. Seeing love as a cognitive process, changing our priorities, pain as a cascade hijacking focus, the self as a collection of useful models. It's a lot.
It really makes you appreciate the sheer, messy, intricate complexity of the mind. And, thinking about AI, it suggests building truly intelligent machines isn't just about rules. It might involve managing resources, building models, handling internal conflicts, maybe even simulating something like these emotional cascades.
Yeah, this deep dive definitely suggests that what feels most immediate to us, like being conscious or just having a feeling, rests on incredibly complex, often hidden machinery.
So, after exploring all these ideas, emotions as thought, the self as models, consciousness perhaps as a post event narrative, here's a final thought to chew on. If our conscious experience, our inner life, is so heavily constructed from these complex, often unconscious processes and narratives created after the fact, how much direct moment to moment control do we really have? And what does that really mean for how we understand ourselves and how we understand each other?